Hello and welcome to Accessibility in Worldbuilding, How Disabled People Move Through Your Worlds. I'm your moderator, Kat Gordon, founder of the Spoonie Authors Network, a community initiative to gather disabled, deaf, and neurodivergent humans who arrange the alphabet. I'm also author of humorous space operas Life in the Cosm and The Stealth Lovers. I co-edited the Nothing Without Us anthology with Talia C. Johnson, which was a 2020 Pre-Aurora Award finalist and is being taught for the second time as part of a disability studies course at Trent University. My latest work, Iris and the Crew, Tear Through Space, is an episodic space opera starring a command crew who live, work, and play in a galaxy teeming with accessibility and accommodation. I just want to say that today Sarah Chorn will not be joining us as she isn't feeling well, so we wish her a very speedy recovery. Just some housekeeping stuff before we begin. I'm going to ask all of our panelists questions for the first half hour, and then I'll ask them questions from the audience. Audience, you can use the Q&A or chat features in Zoom to write your questions for our panelists at any time. After the panel, you can continue the conversation on Discord. Everyone should have a link to it in their Zoom invitation, but our lovely host, Diana, will also post it in the chat of our current Zoom session. Panelists, please keep the length of answers in mind so that everyone can get a chance to participate and we can explore more questions. Are we ready? Let's get to our panelists. Please introduce yourselves and briefly tell us what genre of speculative fiction you enjoyed writing. Oh, I'm going to actually name a person. That would make it go much faster. So I will start with Diana.
Hello, I am Diana Gunn. I am the organizer of this event and the Weeknight Writers Group. I also am a fantasy author. I do all kinds of fantasy, but it is always, well, okay, I do all kinds of fantasy except urban fantasy. It's always fantasy, and it's pretty much always some sort of historically based setting. Yeah, and I am very, very excited about this panel.
I know you are. I'm so psyched too. I even have my ginger ale and everything to suit me up. And thank you, Diana. And next, a good friend of mine, at least that's what I say in public, Stephen Graham King.
Hello, everybody. My pronouns are he, him, or they, them. I am a 17-year survivor of metastatic synovial sarcoma. I deal with reduced mobility in my leg and reduced lung capacity. My genre is space opera primarily, zippy adventure science fiction. I'm known primarily for my Maverick Heart series. There are 3 books out now, one coming in later this year. And also my standalone novel, Chasing Cold.
Awesome. Yes, I am really happy to have you here, and especially since I invited you without your knowledge. So thanks for being there today. And finally, we have someone who really loves horses, Mary Kit Kaelstow. Is it Kaelstow? Am I pronouncing that right?
You are, thank you, yes. And yes, I am a crazy horse and chicken lady. So I write, for the purposes of this panel, I write rural or non-urban-y set fantasy, often featuring disabled or mature characters as my protagonists. I do also write equestrian women's lit and equestrian romance.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mary. So let's get to talking about accessibility and accommodation. Why is it important to have speculative fiction works that include accessibility and accommodation, whether you're writing low-tech stories or advanced tech stories? I'm going to start with Stephen.
For me, because I'm doing far future science fiction, it is very important to me because I need to show that we exist in the future, that we have gone beyond that. As humanity has progressed, so have we. It was, the main thing for me was queer representation, but that has also branched out as I've gone on into disability representation, because for as much as the phrase representation matters gets tossed around these days, it does so because it's important. And it's incredibly important for people with disabilities, for queer people, for people of color, to see themselves presented in narratives. And especially for me, in future narratives. I jokingly said once in an event I did that gay marriage was all well and good, but I want to go to space. So it's really important, I think, that we acknowledge those, that we are present in futures, in alternate realities, in other narratives that we create. It's very important that we exist there.
Yes, exactly. And just quickly, in your work, I remember we just had a podcast together, and you were saying that you design worlds where being queer is never the issue. It's just not an issue. You're just in space doing your space adventures.
Mm-hmm. That, yes, exactly. And that was sort of a very early thing that someone gave me feedback on, that I sort of took to heart, that, okay, let's make that a rule. Let's make that a basic fundamental tenet that the universe is built on. And that has extended further out into representing characters with disabilities. That there were opportunities that I saw in my own world building that gave me a chance to take characters that had initially just defaulted to able-bodied and say, well, no, they don't have to be. They can be deaf, and there would be assistive technology that based on what I've already created. So that's been another thing of just questioning the default.
Yes, exactly.
Which I think a lot of writers just default to that straight white male or able-bodied perspective, instead of just saying, okay, why can this character not be queer, be person of color, be disabled, be any number of other things, and what does that mean for your world? And I think it ends up making your world richer and more layered.
Yes, exactly. Thanks for that, Stephen. Diana?
Sorry, I was too busy agreeing with what Stephen said to remember what I was going to say to this question.
It's all good.
So for me, as a fantasy writer, I think it's important that, I do specifically in my fantasy work to deal with a lot of things like trauma and oppression, but I think it's important to make a conscious decision about what types of oppression we are going to allow to exist within our fantasy worlds, and also what levels of oppression we are going to allow to exist within our own worlds. Ableism definitely is a thing that does exist in my world and is dealt with at times. It is also a place that does have some things that are excessively built in mind. There was historically a king who had a twisted foot. So there are a lot of places where, there are fewer steps and buildings are wider when they were, built in that generation and things like that. And I think it's just really important to be conscious of it when you're creating a fantasy world, how much of that you want to build into it, how much you want to give disabled people room to move, room to exist, and whether or not, because if you're not going to consciously tackling it, if you're not going to consciously decide whether or not to have it, then you are unconsciously reinforcing it.
Yeah, exactly. For sure. See, that was a great answer.
Yeah, it took me a minute. We can agree. Deer in the headlights at that first moment.
No, you're good. We can agree and we can still answer. We got lots of time. We have all day. Mary, what is your answer to that question?
So for me, I write accessibility into my work as part subversiveness, part personal affirmation. I have an invisible disability, and there's a lot of stigma around being high functioning. And so in my case, my characters, I've got one with rheumatoid arthritis. I have one with multiple sclerosis, that, you know, use a cane, use a rollator, need a wheelchair, and yet can pretty much, you know, kick these people into shape. Maybe not physically, but in my worlds, there's a lot of fighting against hidebound bureaucracies, which I hope is more exciting than that sounds. But so in my case, I basically write it to say, we are here, we're doing things, but that doesn't mean that we don't need help. And in fact, in a story I just finished, one of the characters just turned to the other one and said, why don't we all just have golf carts? Because you keep using your rollator to go between classrooms, and this is stupid. And, you know, and in a good way. In other words, they're dealing with an emergency, and she's like, we need a golf cart. This is crazy. And she's the one who is the kick butt, take names type. And so for me, it's because it needs to be there. And so I do it kind of to be subversive.
Excellent. Thank you, Mary. I'm just going to, it's funny, you know, that doesn't sound boring to me. You know, the bureaucracy thing, that sounds like life. While we have cures for various diseases and conditions here on Earth, why might it be harmful to only have cure narratives in fiction? For example, should magic cure all things? Should futurism stories always have a permanent cure for anything we can think of? What do you think about that, Mary?
I think no. But I believe, like, in the terms of magic has a cost. And so if you have magic powerful enough to cure somebody, what does that cost? What does that cost personally? What does that cost, you know, spiritually? So, and I think it's dangerous to have cure narratives, because not first you're saying that whatever the disability is, mental, physical, emotional, that it's broken, as opposed to, you know, diversity, and we're all different with different abilities, and our bodies are wired differently. So I think having a cure narrative reinforces the fact that those of us who identify as disabled are broken and need fixed, like we're a table with a loose leg, or something. And I also think that it's the easy way out. And I don't know about others, but as a writer, I don't like to take the easy way out. I like to make things hard for myself.
Relatable. Stephen?
I think that there's a couple of there's some nuance here in terms of if we're talking a future where everything has been cured, and you as a writer are doing that because you find disability icky and you just don't want to acknowledge it, that's one thing. But I think there's also can be a place for narratives in which not everything is curable or treatable, but some things are.
Yes.
And some things can be dealt with, and the narrative can be about what a character's experience is with that, what their experience is going in. Do they think about what that means and how their life will change? What is the change like for them afterwards? If it's a narrative in which cure is not the only option, then I think there's a lot of story potential there. And I always come back to one of the best pieces of writing advice I ever got from Noel Hopkinson, which was, you can do whatever you want as long as you know why you're doing it. So you have to know what your reason is behind the narrative that you're crafting and why you're telling the story in that way and presenting the character in that way. And I sort of come at this a little bit from a person who had a very large portion of my life without disability, and then there was the turning point when it occurred, and that I've been living with since. So I also come from it as a point of view of, if someone were to say to me, here's a schwanky bionic limb that works just like your old one did, I'd be like, gimme. So acknowledgement of, again, nuance, that curing everything and no one ever has a disability or an illness ever again isn't nuanced. So if everything's curable or treatable, no. But again, there can be some room for well thought out cure narratives in some cases.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And, you know, with Mary saying like not wanting to take the easy way out, that's not the easy way out in writing. To be able to write something with nuance. It's like something could either happen to someone or someone is born with a condition. Okay, so this part we have a cure for. And now for how you live your life from this point on, we have other assistive tech and all that kind of thing. That's not easy to write. You actually have to do research into it. So yeah, I agree that some things are curable, but making everything curable, it's not a personal fan favorite of mine. Diana, what do you think?
Well, I feel like I come at this from a somewhat different perspective, because I specifically write a lot of stories about war and violence and the consequences of that. And if you can cure everything and fix every injury, that kind of cheapens that. So it would very much defeat a lot of the purpose of my storytelling. Especially, you know, if I were to have some kind of magic where you could just draw like the PTSD out of a person's brain, like, well, there goes my entire brand. I write stories about badasses who overcome PTSD. Like,
Yeah, exactly. You could just have a cover with a whole bunch of pretty blank pages in it.
exactly. So yeah, I feel like, and also I would say certainly in things that I've watched where they have a science or magical cure for everything, it takes a really good writer to work with a system like that and not lose some of the suspense, not lose some of, you know, what keeps the reader there, because there's not as much risk to the characters, right? And it that's what keeps us interested in stories a lot of the time. I mean, obviously this doesn't apply to like romance and things, but I'm obviously not that kind of writer.
Hey, I wrote a romance short story about a disabled and autistic person. So it can happen. There's a lot of snark in it, but you know, it can still happen. So actually, you know, touching upon like really, I guess, the experiences of all of our panelists today, how does your lived experience influence the type of accommodation and accessibility you build into your world? What do you do when you want to include characters who do not share your lived experience? So it's a two-part question about your lived experience, and what do you do when it's not your lived experience? I'll start with Stephen.
It was interesting when I was thinking about how I was going to answer this question. I realized that in the very first book of the Maverick Heart Cycle, Soul's Blood, I think was the last time I mentioned stairs or steps. And that was written, that original draft was written before my own health experience and my own disability. And since then, I can't think of an instance where I included stairs or steps in any kind of physical setting. And the big thing for me was in my hero-ship in the series, the Maverick Heart itself, which is one of the main characters because it's sentient. It drove me crazy seeing things like Killjoys, where the the ship was 2 levels, and the only way you got between them was this little skinny little metal rung ladder, which great if that's easy for you to navigate. So my ship is 1 level. It's basically it's a space bungalow. Everything is on 1 level. There's no up and down, there's no elevators, there's no ladders to climb up. Everything is 1 level. And that was not a super conscious thing that I just sort of, as I was going, realized, wait a minute, I don't put stairs or steps in anymore because I hate stairs or steps these days. In terms of when I'm not writing a lived experience of my own, I talked to somebody who lived that experience. I was at a panel at CanCon a couple of years ago, and there was a person on the panel who was deaf talking about accessibility, and that led me to create a character in the book I just finished that was deaf because I realized I had this tech already that I created that would function perfectly as an interpretive assistive device. Mm-hmm. So I sat down and talked to them and said, look, this is what I'm thinking of doing. This is my idea. This is how the stuff works. What do you think? And got that feedback. And in the book that I'm writing next, I wanted to put in a person who uses a power chair. And so I spoke to someone who, again, uses one and said, look, this is the character. This is who they are in the story. This is what I'm trying to do. How does that sound? And right. Got the feedback from somebody who lived that experience to make sure I wasn't being exploitative. I wasn't using the disability as a crutch or a convenient way of just making the character just the power chair user guy. So do your homework and talk to people who have that experience, and then use a sensitivity editor once you have written it.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Stephen. Mary?
For me, I write the accessibility that I wish I had. And the experiences I wish I had. And the people who, and I have not written any characters who have pushed back against that. For example, my head of the Pegasus Academy, who has rheumatoid arthritis, basically this is what she needs, this is what she is, and this is, how people go about it. And in getting to what Stephen said about talking to people, one of the best compliments that I ever got was one of my readers said, oh my gosh, I can't believe you've included this in a book. I never see this. And I said, please, please, please tell me if I got something wrong, because I only went off of research. And she said, no, you got this. You got this right. And I was like, oh my gosh, I was like, I won the Oscar. So in my case, I do, it's wish fulfillment. I write the accessibility and the acceptance that I wish I had with my disability.
I so get that. The latest thing that I'm working on is it's dream stuff. So part of it is my own dream stuff as well. So I totally get that. And I think it's important to write like that too, because people who can invent stuff read our work and you never know what's going to come up in the future. I really appreciate that answer. Diana?
So well, my main thing is PTSD. As I mentioned, I tend to write a lot of characters with that or depression and anxiety. For them, well, the thing that comes out of my experience is that they don't have access to help. They have each other, and they have to muddle through it together because, frankly, there isn't, to my knowledge, there is not actually a single country in this world that has adequate mental health treatment readily available to the average citizen.
Yeah, we have a big problem with that in our own country as well. And there's also this idea of PTSD being a monolith, that a soldier who comes back from a warlike situation can have PTSD and almost nobody else can. So while it's valid for those who have been in those military situations to have PTSD, PTSD can affect a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. And so I feel that, and I do appreciate that you're writing about that, because there's going to be readers who will relate to that as well. You know, that just reminds me, though, a lot of times when we talk about disability, we talk about physical disabilities, and you know, mental illness can also be a disability as well, and it's very important that that's represented. What I'm going to do is, it's almost 12 o'clock. I'm going to take a little peek from our audience questions and see if we can get to those, because I'm always interested in what attendees have to ask us. I'm seeing one here. To all the panelists, when imagining futures or alternate paths, should we also think about how changes will create new disabilities? Good question. I'll start with Diana.
Ooh, that is really interesting. So I absolutely do think we should think about that. I think that certainly the first thing that comes to mind is science fiction and disabilities that are going to be caused by climate change. You know, lung problems that are caused by breathing in the toxic air of the world around you, stuff like that. In terms of my own work, in terms of fantasy work, what happens when someone is magically injured? Can magical injuries be healed, or are magical injuries different from regular injuries? Things like that are really important to consider. And also, what level of medicine do you have? What level, if your medicine is mostly magic, what is that magic actually capable of curing? How many, you know, because before we had vaccines, we had all of these illnesses that kids routinely got that left large portions of the kids who got them permanently disabled. And so if you don't have modern medicine, well, does magic actually deal with those things, or are you going to have a much higher number of disabled people because those are the consequences of these illnesses?
Exactly. Mary?
So yeah, that's a great question. And I could see going in a few different directions with that. But something that's very current that comes to mind is long COVID, for example, because there's been a lot of talk in the MECFS world, fibromyalgia world, going, hey, guess what? You know, this looks really familiar, guys. But then there's also been a lot of people going, oh, nope, 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 you know, and again, it's the same, you know, same song, different verse about it. And I think it's important to think about. And like Diana said, with magical injuries, you know, there's different disabilities that can happen because of magic, or having your magic cut off or taken away from you. Or different, you know, again, new diseases coming forward. I think definitely there is room to think beyond the stereotypical idea of disability, because our current experience has shown us that it's a spectrum, and it's not only what you think it is.
Exactly. Thank you. Stephen?
Absolutely. I mean, from a simple point of making your stories as believable as possible, you look back at our own history. I mean, disease and illness and treatment was so different 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago, that it only makes sense that's not going to be the same 200 years, 300 years, 500 years in the future, especially if you're looking at, like I do, expansion out into space. There's so many other issues that come into that in terms of what it does to your body, you know, alien environments, all sorts of things, that the landscape will obviously change. It will be a different environment that people will be in, and therefore our bodies will respond in different ways. So it's completely sensible and logical that what we experience in a future or an alternate environment will not be the same, and that our experiences of illness and disability and treatment and cure and all of those things will no longer be the same.
Yeah.
Something I would like to add to that, if you would like to get a broader feel for the history of medicine and how these things have developed in a fun and easy to digest way, I highly recommend the podcast Sawbones. There are hundreds of episodes, and they've done some particularly fascinating ones on things like polio and measles, all those things we do have vaccines for, and how those used to impact huge portions of the population. So it's a really, really good resource. I'm not affiliated with them in any way. I just enjoy their podcast.
Excellent. You know what?
Sawbones.
We should put that in the Discord too, links to that, or in the chat, because that'd be awesome. Okay, another question from our audience. I'm writing a wartime novel where a point of view character from a military family has an accident and can't serve in the war like he always imagined he would. Can you offer some tips for expressing his frustration with those changes in his goals and his body? He's got a number of toxic ideas that he needs to leave behind over the course of the book, but I'm worried about hurting readers with his point of view's internalized ableism. That is also a really good question. Internalized ableism. I think many of us can relate to that as well. I see, I just felt like the romper room woman for a second. Mary, can we start with you for that one?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. And that sounds like such a powerful character to write. And with that, I would say two things. One of which is something that I don't think is talked about enough, even in the disability community, is the grief that comes. Stephen talked about this, BD, AD, before disability, after disability. And that grief and coming to terms with that can be a powerful character journey, even without everything else going on in the life. And the other thing I would say is, on one hand, if this person, there's no if, this person, we all deal with internalized ableism at some point or other, it's okay. And I think understanding that, hey, this is what we deal with and how we move through this is as much part of that character's journey as anything else. And so don't be afraid of going too dark or too negative. I think whether we are disabled people putting ourselves out in a public space or writing disabled characters, there's this fear that if I'm too negative or if I'm not happy all the time, that people are going to turn away. I know I personally deal with this. And the thing is, those that do aren't ready for that message. And there will be people who read that story that break down in tears because they're so grateful for being seen and being validated. Write the story you want to write, and I think the rest will sort itself out.
Thank you for that, Mary. Diana?
So I have a lot to say about this one, actually. So in one of my current works in progress, one of the major characters has recently been blinded, which is a pretty major disability. We rely on our sight a lot. And I absolutely do have him struggle with it. And, first of all, I really wanted to make sure that because I had this character and I had his struggle be such an important part of this next book, that I also include a broader variety of disabled people who don't have that arc, who are, settled in their disability and who are living their best lives despite it or because of it. They've found a way to work with it or around it, depending on what it is. And, because every disability is seen somewhat differently by society. And so it's harder or easier for some of us, depending on how you're seen and accommodated or not accommodated. But I wanted to make sure that he wasn't the only disabled person, that wasn't the only narrative of disability that existed in this story. And going back to what Steven said earlier, I hired multiple sensitivity readers. And I got a lot of really helpful feedback. And, there were points where they said, okay, this is a little bit much in terms of, the grieving and the struggling with internalized ableism. But for the most part, it was really well received and really appreciated. And the very nuanced feedback that I got has really allowed me to shape that narrative more firmly and to really, root it in the actual experience of disabled people. Because when you become disabled, it is a loss. And you have to reconcile with what the shape of your life is going to be now. And at least for a lot of the disabled people, I know a lot of us used to be overachievers who did like all the things all the time, and now can't do like half the things that a normal person is supposed to be able to do. And that is an incredible struggle, and it should be represented. Just don't make it the only narrative of disability in your worlds.
That makes sense. And I absolutely cannot relate to what you mean about the overachieving thing and all that. That's just, wow. Some people feel like that, really? Very relatable. Stephen?
The only things that I can add are do your homework, read, learn as much as you can about the process, and from people who have it. And again, and reiterate, sensitivity readers, do the work. Make sure that you are not turning this person into an object or just a disability, that they are a person with a story, with an arc, with genuine starting point and end point to their story. And like I said, research, get a sensitivity editor, and then listen to them if they tell you that you're off the mark, and adapt to that.
Yes, truly. And just my quick 2 cents is, don't be afraid to write about internalized ableism. It is something that so many of us go through in our journey. And even on the Spoonie Authors Network, we did a series about internalized ableism. So it's a reality that a lot of us go through. So you're probably won't hurt people by bringing up the notion of internalized ableism. But again, like the other panelists say, sensitivity editors and readers can really help. And researching, own voices articles can also really help. Okay, next question. How much research goes into your characters when they are not own voice narratives? Weeks, months, years? And have any of you written about other forms of neurodivergence like ADHD? So, Diana?
That depends on how important the character is. My character, I have a minor character who has a twisted foot. I've done a little bit of research into various mobility aids and accommodations, but he's a minor character, so I haven't done that much. I've mostly just listened to my friends who have disabilities. The blind character I mentioned earlier, I've spent 3 years doing research, mostly in the form of just finding people and listening to blind people. There's a YouTuber I follow, Molly Burke, who has a lot of really fascinating information. She talks a lot about her experience of going blind, which was really useful, and also a lot about the accommodations, and has some really interesting videos on Braille. And so I like to go to the source. I don't like to read academic stuff about disability, because to me, I mean, watching a YouTube video may not seem like valid research, but when you are watching a YouTube video by a disabled person about their disability, it's like getting a primary source for your research.
Mm-hmm.
That's essentially what it is. It is the person living through the thing.
Yeah.
In historian studies, a primary source is the most valuable thing in the world. And so that's really what I try to get to. It also helps that I do run the Spoonie Authors podcast, and I have learned so much about accessibility and various disabilities through interviewing amazing people, including both of the people on this panel. And actually, I'm interviewing Sarah, who was supposed to be here in a couple weeks.
Oh, way cool, way cool. Stephen?
I don't know that there's a single answer to that question, just because it's going to depend on the character and how important they are and what your knowledge is. I mean, for me, one of the major characters, there was dealing with some neuropathy and physical pain based on prosthetic limbs. That was me, so I didn't need to search somewhere else, because I could draw from my own feelings about that and my own experience of that. A lot of the other instances are characters who are present and relevant to the story, but are not major. They're present more for what their purpose in the grander narrative and what they do for that, and the disability is secondary. So in those cases, it was more a case of, like I said, when I had the deaf character and the technology, I sort of said, okay, look, this is the character I'm thinking of. This is how I'm going to use the tech. Does that make sense? And got that feedback with the power chair. I was like, look, the character is not there to be a power chair user. The character is there to impart information and unlock these parts of the plot over here. So it was more just, am I on the right track? Okay, let's go. And then having a bit of faith in yourself to go, okay, am I at least going in the right direction? And then being ready to make corrections as you go, if necessary. So there's no way. I think you're going to have to trust yourself on some level, but you're also going to have to put in some of the work and, again, understand why the character is there and why the disability is there and what it all means in the big picture. So it's going to depend. It's going to depend on every individual case, unfortunately.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stephen. Mary?
Yeah, I'd pretty much just want to echo what both my fellow panelists have said on that. In my case, one of the free stories I'm writing and serializing for my Patreon, the main character, to get back to the neurodivergent part of it, has severe anxiety after a trauma and some complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And so, in that case, that was real life. I mean, that was me. So I wrote, that into that. My mom was an RN. I've been around health care and geriatric care and different things most of my life. And so for a lot of it, like Stephen said, trust yourself, trust your knowledge, and, research when you have to, and when it's necessary, and, broaden your circle, hang out with disabled people, hang out with, Black, Indigenous people of color, hang out with people who aren't in your group, and just listen, because you will learn a lot.
Just do it online right now, because there's still a virus.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Virtual research. Just my 2 cents in my, as I discovered my own neurodivergence, I'm autistic. I realized that I was weaving neurodivergence in both Life in the Cosm and the Stealth Lovers. But for Iris and the Crew, I have an autistic character. And even though he's a fella, I've put pretty in-depth own voices experience into that character. Like, for example, auditory sensory overload is a big thing with me as well. Right. So I have included what it feels to be autistic for me. But again, in terms of months, years, I'm taking a while with my book because I'm having a lot of different representations in it. And some of them are so far out of my lane. I actually, like Diana, need to go to YouTube, understand, certain lived experiences of people so that I can craft, even though it's space opera, I'd like to know how things here are on Earth, and then I craft my space opera, and then I like to, you know, cross my T's and dot my I's. So I have to get sensitivity readers again, like Stephen said. Does this make sense? Is you know, my personal ambition is so that people don't read my work and say, burn it with fire. You know, it is a learning process when you write out of your lane. But I think people will see when you are generally trying to represent people. And it does take, there is no one timeline for how long it takes to do that. You will understand it as you start the writing process. I got to go to another question. Oh, actually, this is a question that I think we should perhaps answer in links. The question is, what resources do you use to find sensitivity readers for your work? We have a list of sensitivity readers on the Spoonie Authors Network under the resources menu, but if the panelists would like to supply their own links, maybe in the chat, and we could also put them on Discord as well to answer that question. I think that would be effective so people can have something they can copy and paste. Let's see. Now I am going to just take a little bit, just want to make sure that I haven't missed any questions here. Oh, here's a great question. I wanted to ask about including disabled characters when you're not disabled. I'm trans and queer, so I really get the narrative of not writing oppressions you're not knowledgeable of, but at the same time, I wish books were more diverse with the cast/world, sorry. And usually everyone agrees on including diversity in books, but how to do it without being harmful or tokenizing those characters just for the sake of diversity? Where would you put the line? Is it better to leave room for disabled authors to write their stories and we just take a step back? I love this question. I love this question. What do you think? What do you think about that? We'll start with Stephen this time.
I think while it is very important that own voices narratives exist, it's incredibly important that people of marginalized experiences tell their own stories. It's incredibly important. But I don't think we should be the only ones. And I think that there's always room for disabled characters in narratives written by people who are not disabled. And I think the key word there is not being knowledgeable, because as we've said already, you can become knowledgeable. That knowledge doesn't have to be firsthand lived experience. That knowledge can be research. It can be sensitivity editors. It can be imagination. It can be learning how to see into that. And in terms of tokenism, if the character exists for a reason, if the character exists in a way that moves the plot, that is part of it, and is part of the plot in a way that doesn't depend on their disability, that they have other things that they bring to the story and what's happening and how the plot resolves, that as long as they don't exist just to be disabled, to make abled people feel good about themselves or to inspire someone to try harder. If you can avoid those tropes, and again, research them, that the knowledge is there. There are plenty of people in the world who are talking about those tropes and talking about ableism. I will have to dig it out. I found a link a few weeks back about tropes around disability, and I will dig it out and see if I can find it for the Discord channel, because there was very good looks at line by line these various things that to not do. And it's a really good resource if you are writing that, because like I said, you can become knowledgeable. If you put in the work, the information is there that will enable you to write meaningful, relevant, rounded, disabled characters.
Yes, thank you for that. And I think we are going to probably be using Discord to put a lot of links, because even on the Spoonie Authors Network, we have a series called Disability Tropes 101. So I think that's also another resource. Mary, what do you think?
So part of me wants to answer the question and say, well, should I get out of the way and let able-bodied people tell their own stories? Because I write able-bodied characters as well. So, but seriously, and I totally understand where the questioner is coming from. And it's something that I think many of us struggle with. I included a biracial character in one of my novellas. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm a white girl from Iowa. Should I really be doing this? And, I hope, I hope I did. I hope I did the representation, well. I hope I did. But, several resources have been mentioned. Learn about lived experience, sensitivity readers, or if you can't afford sensitivity readers, just listening in those communities and just listening. I believe the more people that write more diverse stories, it normalizes diverse representation. And so as long as you know why you want to include this character and why you're writing this character in the story in your heart, and I'd say this goes personally, I feel like this goes for any representation, and you're aware of those tropes and you're aware of what not to do, please do it, because the more voices the better.
Yes, exactly. Whenever I say normal or normalize, it's always in quotes, but like normalize our presence in your stories for sure. Diana?
So, I mean, I think there's a lot of layers to this. If it's really the story that you want to write, I mean, go ahead and write it. Just be prepared. Like, if it's a POV character, you're probably gonna have to do years of research. In terms of minor characters, though, I think that's personally where I sprinkle in a lot of my diversity. My main characters are generally cis white women because, that's where I'm comfortable. They may have various other, identities as well, but that's where I start. But I have lots of characters, who are men who have various disabilities, a smattering of people of color. It's a very isolated culture, so not, a ton of them, but they do have, those characters in the background, those people. Whenever I'm describing a crowd, I make sure that, that crowd includes marginalized people, that it's normalized that they are there even in the background. They aren't only there when they are here to be prominent and displayed, like, ooh, look at me, I have a disabled character. No, they're everywhere. They do exist in the background. And, that really, I think, helps reduce the risk of tokenization, because, you can see that these people exist beyond the one or two characters. Even if you only meet the other disabled people very briefly, you still know they're there.
Yes, exactly. I'm going to just take one more question from the audience. I read somewhere that a sign of civilization is that an injury is cared for and mended. Do you think the same could be said for a group of people that have cared for a member with a disability? Oh, that's interesting, because now we're seeing the point of view of people who care for disabled people. So what do you think about that, Diana?
I mean, I my first thought is yes, if they are actually properly caring for them, like if it's not done, with resentment, or, if you're, because the thing is, a lot of caretakers will shame, abuse, treat their, the people they're caring for as burdens, make that person feel terrible for just existing. So it really depends on the nature of the care those people are providing. But if those people are providing real, genuine care and real genuine accommodations and listening to what the disabled person has to say and giving them autonomy in the choice of what accommodations they have, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mary?
I just read, and I can't remember now if it was a bona fide article or like a little Facebook snippet from somebody who works in the field, that they have discovered a Neanderthal skeleton of this person clearly had physical disabilities and clearly lived based on the age of the bones, like into their 50s. So for that society, basically it was rethinking what you think of as Neanderthal, because clearly the society took care of this person until his natural death. And then they were juxtaposing it with our current society. So it was interesting. So I think yes and no. I think caring, obviously it's a sign of compassion and a sign of empathy to care for those and to support everybody in society. I'm at a personal place where I'm not sure I would put civilization on it, but I suspect that has more to do with my own current concerns over our current civilization, as well as being a caretaker, than anything like story wise. So I think that's all I'll say on that.
Okay.
I find myself reminded on your comment between society and civilization of a quote. I'm not sure if this is a true story or if it was made up, but it's really funny. And it's someone asked the Dalai Lama what he thinks of Western civilization, and he says, "It sounds like it would be a great idea."
We should get on that sometime. Stephen?
Yeah, I think what makes that a little bit loaded is the term care. I think if we're talking more in terms of integration and full and responsible integration into culture at large, then yes, that is definitely going to be a hallmark of a strong society or civilization, is that everybody is taken care of. Nobody's left behind. Nobody is left to their own devices when we can all take care of each other. So yeah, I think that's that care gets to be kind of a loaded word when you're dealing with disabilities. When yes, if it's a question of bringing people in and making sure that they have what they need and they have the abilities to function to the best of what they can, then yes, that's absolutely a hallmark of a strong society and civilization, I would say.
Thanks so much, Stephen. And you know what? It's time for me just to go quickly to our panelists so that people know where to find your work, because we are almost over, people. That went so fast. Stephen, since I see you right on my screen, can you please tell people where to follow you and your work?
Best place is stephengrahamking.com. Everything is there. There's some examples of writing, my photography, links to all of my social media. It's all right there, one-stop shop.
Thanks, Stephen. Diana?
I can be found on Twitter at Diana L. Gunn. I also have an author website at authordianagunn.com, and I run the Author Marketing Club, which is a free educational initiative via businessforauthors.com.
Thanks, Diana. Mary?
So you can find links to everything I do at marykitkailstow.com. If you are interested in learning more about a disabled lady running a homestead, as well as the intersection of agriculture and speculative fiction, I am launching the Fantasy Farmer podcast, which will have a little bit of everything, combining my two loves. And you can learn more about that either from the link on my website or at marymuse.com.
Thank you so much, Mary. And thank you to all our panelists and all of the audience who've asked questions.